important to think about in terms of how we think about most other forms of data. So when we think about censuses and census data, it's really important to think about what our data mean and how they actually match the operationalization that we are going to be trying to using. So when we have census data, does the concept match what the data are actually telling us, even if it's really good looking census data? Then the other question is, what are the incentives and capabilities do actors in the census food chain or the supply chain have in terms of producing different types of data? And here I'm using a term from Mihai and Kapur's article from 2012 in Political Analysis, which argues that at every stage of data collection, there's different people with different incentives and different ideas that can influence how we perceive census data. So to do that, I'm going to be talking about language data from the Soviet and post-Soviet censuses to illustrate a lot of these issues. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what we're going to be talking about, or what I'm going to be talking about, is about how to match concepts with data. And to actually do that, it's important to have a concept to give as an example. And so I'm going to be talking about language because it's a topic near and dear to my heart, and also something that's covered in a lot of censuses. So when we think about language, there are two different ways that people often think about it. One is as an important identity marker. So if you're an ethnic Tatar, speaking your language is a symbol of group membership, and identifying with the language, even if you don't speak it, may also be an important identity membership. Equally importantly, especially when we're talking about the incentives of people producing census data, is that governments are very aware of the symbolism. So especially in the post-Soviet sphere, we have a lot of governments whose legitimacy is at least to some extent tied to programs of revitalizing and protecting and developing titular or the cultures after which their region was named. So Tatarstan and Tatars, Kazakhstan for Kazakhs, etc. Which means that these governments have very strong incentives to show certain things with data about language. Now, on another level, and what I've been focusing on in my own research, is that language isn't just important as a symbol of identity, but it's also important to social mobility. So speaking the language which is prevalent in the region in which you reside is going to be really important for getting access to jobs, to getting education, to basically living your day-to-day life well. Which means that instead of thinking about language just as an aspect of identity, it's important to think about what it actually means for how people live. Now, when we're thinking about census data, this means that we need to start thinking about what we're actually interested in. So are we interested in language as a symbol, or are we interested in language as an issue of day-to-day life? And similarly, we're going to need to think about how this different content can potentially influence capabilities and incentives for data manipulation. So the data that I'm going to be discussing, or which I'm going to be focusing on, are Soviet censuses and then post-Soviet censuses. Now, the Soviet censuses, in almost all of them had, well, actually in all of them had a question about ethnic identity or nationalist. And then they had a question, most of them had a question about native language, so родной язык. And then from 1970 onward, they had a question about, is there a second Soviet language that you speak fluently? Now, I'm going to be discussing in detail like the problems with this type of measurement strategy, but it's worth noting that, to paraphrase the Big Lebowski, say what you will about the tenets of Soviet language counting, at least it was an ideology. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, language data became very, very disparate. So we have some countries that have yet to conduct a post-Soviet census, others that only include questions about ethnic identity, and others that only include questions about native language, others that include new and novel questions to fulfill different political objectives. Which means that if we're actually trying to come up with some sort of time series about language, we're probably going to immediately try to focus on the one that we have the most sort of, at least theoretically, comparable data about from the beginning to the more recent data, which means that often scholars who are looking at language will focus on the native language question. Now, this is a problem because while the native language is probably the most commonly available linguistic statistic, or at least the statistic that has language in the name, it's also the most problematic. So the reason it's a problem is that no one actually knows what exactly a native language is. Actually, most people have an idea of what a native language is, but there's no consistent idea. So often there's an idea that a native language is actually the language of your group. So if you're Tatar, your native language is Tatar, regardless of whether or not you speak a word. Now, obviously, in this conceptualization, language actually the question has absolutely no content aside from its relationship to the ethnic identity. So it tells you nothing about whether or not people actually speak the language. There are other people who interpret it more linguistically. So is it a language you're comfortable in? Is it the first language you learned? but there's a whole lot of disparity across time and space. And equally importantly, often the way that people interpreted it was impacted by the way that the governments portrayed it, which means that how people considered a native language question is going to be a function of government policies, which means that if we're trying to use native language to measure linguistic effects on government policies, we've got a huge reciprocal causality issue. What all this means is that it's generally not a good measure of proficiency, and it's often generally correlated with ethnic identity. Now, people are pretty aware of this issue, but what is so perhaps less clear, and the other way that this can be misleading, is that there are big downstream problems with using this question for other questions with regard to language. So as I mentioned earlier, the second way that the Soviets collected data on language was by asking, is there a second Soviet language which you speak fluently? The way this was phrased was it assumed that native language was something in which you were fluent. So you said, I'm fluent in Tatar. It means that you can't declare Tatar as a language in which you're fluent as a second language, which means that if we try to come up with a measure of proficiency in a language across time and across space, using a combination of native language and a second language, it means that we're probably going to be overcounting the proportion of people who actually speak the language because a lot of people who speak it as a native language don't actually speak it at all. Similarly, if we take out native language, then we've got a measure that systematically undercounts the proportion of people who speak it, because again, those who speak it as a native language are probably also going to be the most likely to speak it, which means that we have sort of a darned if you do, darned if you don't situation. That said, there are some ways out. So for some groups, in particular ethnic Russians, who generally only declared speaking a native language and no fluency in other language, so obviously huge variation across time and space, but as sort of a rule writ large, especially in Soviet censuses, potentially using something like Russian native plus Russian as a second language is probably going to be a decent way of measuring Russian proficiency. However, that's not the case for most other languages. So having spoken a little bit about operationalization, or how to match concept onto, or how you can be misled by matching a concept onto an actual form of data, it's worthwhile to think about the other way that census data can go awry. And here I'm taking a screenshot from the Herrera and Caprera article I mentioned at the very beginning from Political Analysis in 2012, which shows all the people on any sort of social scientific supply chain, data supply chain. So you have all these different actors involved in creating data, all of whom have their own incentives and their own capabilities, all of which can lead to problems with interpreting data, or at least making the data not necessarily reflect what you want it to. So when you think about census data, I'm going to focus on two main levels, but the sort of supply chain that I at least think of in my own head when I'm thinking about census data is I think of citizens talking to enumerators, then giving it to Census Bureau, who then aggregate the data, and then governments who then decide how to portray the data. And then obviously governments also influences the questions that are asked by the Census Bureau, as well as potentially how the data are collected, as Cynthia can definitely talk about at length. And so here I'm going to take out the enumerators in the Census Bureau, not because they're not important, they're hugely important. And if you want information about Census Bureau politics, I definitely recommend reading Yoshika's Herrera's book about the Mirrors of the Economy, about the Gazprom in Russia. But the two things that I want to focus on are probably the most prevalent in people's minds are what citizens are doing when they're telling us linguistic data, and then what governments are doing when they're deciding what questions to ask. So when we're thinking about citizens, and when we're thinking, we need to think about both what they can do and what they want to do. So when you have a question like native language, which has no sort of consistent definition, it's kind of unclear what citizens are thinking when they respond to that question. It also means that opportunities for manipulation are going to be greater because, again, if a government really wants citizens to identify with a particular language, they will stress, like, declare it as your native language if it's language of your group, or perhaps even if they want to promote a language that is not necessarily directly identified with a group, they might say, identify the language that you speak the most fluently. All of these could definitely influence citizens because they may not have a strict idea of what they're supposed to be responding to, which means that this could lead to very big misconceptions with the data. Similarly, we can also think about the incentives citizens have to respond to certain types of responses. So citizens, again, based on identity, might decide to count themselves as fluent in a language even if they aren't, simply because they want to show support for their group or because they want to feel better about themselves and their linguistic capabilities. Now, the final thing to note before I show a pretty picture that hopefully brings a lot of this together is what governments want. As I mentioned earlier, governments have incentives to show success in language policy. which means that when we think about languages, we should really always think about, or linguistic data or any type of data, we should think about what the government wants to use these data for. And then we should also think about what capabilities they have to meet their incentives. So here, I don't mean necessarily the ability of a government to falsify data, which is definitely going to be a case in really authoritarian countries, but I mean more in sort of how they decide to phrase certain types of questions. So the classic example here, drawing on the work of Bahan Dave, is this idea that in Kazakhstan, in later censuses, instead of asking about fluency directly about in the language, they ask instead, do you understand the spoken language? Which means is obviously a lower bar than speaking a language fluency. It asks whether or not you understand, which means that obviously using this statistic, especially if you try to compare it to statistics coming from previous years, you're going to see a pretty high increase in fluency because you're not actually measuring fluency, but rather proportion of people who speak the language or understand the spoken language as opposed to speaking it themselves. So the final thing I want to do in this presentation before I hand it over to the next presenter is to show how this all sort of comes together. And this is data from Kalmykia, which is a Russian republic, where they speak as a titular language, the Kalmyk language. And basically what you see here on the vertical axis is the proportion of speakers of the Kalmyk language going from 100% to 0%. And then you have on the vertical axis, or sorry, the horizontal axis, you have years. And each of these different squares represents a different census. Each of the different lines represents a different way of asking about language or ethnic identity. And there's one sort of key thing to note here, which, well, there's a bunch of key things to note here, but the first thing I'm going to mention is that if you look at the data from this ethnic identity, which is this dark, well, kind of light blue square line, you see that it goes down from the 1920s to the 1960s, and then goes up, stabilizes in the 1970s and 1980s, and then continues to go up after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And if you look at the native language question, which follows a very similar pattern, again, because native language is roughly a good way of measuring ethnic identity in many contexts, you see that the native language is telling you the same story as ethnic identity. Then you can focus on this native language plus second language spoken fluently, which is this yellow line, which essentially overlaps with native language because non-native speakers of Kalmyk generally didn't declare it as a second language. All of these, again, tell you a similar story. Now, once you get into the post-Soviet period, the story gets interesting. As I mentioned earlier, if you look at the census data about language, native language and ethnic identity, you'd say that there's an increasing proportion of speakers of the Kalmyk language. However, if we look at other types of data, so here the crosses are representations of the Colton Huff survey, and then these are microcensuses about different questions about, do you speak the language at home? Do you speak it most usually? You see a different story, namely low fluency in the language. So if you look at the native language question, you tell a very different story than a question that actually asks about linguistic proficiency. And I'm over my time, so I will conclude there, but I look forward very much to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyle. That was fascinating. Our next speaker is Dr. Mihai Surdu, who has worked in several top European research institutes and is currently a visiting researcher at Freiburg University. His research, including a book examining Roma classification, addresses scientific and administrative practices of identification, ethnic groupness, and data collection practices. His remarks concentrate on insights from the Romanian census approaches to nationality and specifically the identification of Roma. Dr. Surdu, I hand it to you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. I'm honored to be part of this panel and to learn from it. So before starting proper my presentation, I wanted to make a footnote to it and to say that every time I will say the term gypsies, this should be read or seen or heard in quotation marks because it is how it was used in the documents I will refer to. So, as the title of my paper already shows, my talk today will address two topics: census as a form of an ethnic self-identification learning and as a ground of resistance to ethnic categorization. I will start with a little personal history describing my own experience as a field operator in a social survey about Roma in the early 90s. I believe it is illustrative for the formative character of expert inquiries on ethnicity. For that survey, I had to decide whether the interviewee was a Roma person or not. Towards the end of the questionnaire, I had to ask, what is your ethnicity? I was instructed to wait for the answer and, if the case, to help by showing or reading the list with predetermined categories: Romanian, Hungarian, Roma or Gypsy, German, and other. Subjects were expected to choose a single designation. Except a few cases when the answer was directly Romanian or Gypsy, most of the respondents did not sort themselves into a category. In several cases, the answer was, tick whatever you like, what you think is best to be noted. I felt it was incorrect to note my perception rather than that of the subject. Nevertheless, I had to circle a category. So, insisting on having the subject's answer, I reframed the question as such: to which ethnic group do you belong? Some answer, it's your choice, put the right thing, write what you think is good. Similar dialogue sometimes lasted for minutes without helping me to circle a single ethnic category as the questionnaire requested. In many cases, in order to finalize my task, I had to decide myself who was a Roma and who was not a Roma. After some years, when I returned in the same communities, the things have changed. The people seem to be no more hesitant about their ethnicity. Since the 90s, hundreds of Roma-related studies have been carried out in Romania and all over Europe. In Romania, only in 2 decades, there were at least 18 nationwide Roma-targeted surveys and tens of smaller regional or local surveys carried out by the NGOs. In addition, there were 2 national censuses. I will give more details a bit later about the last one from 2011. My argument is that through repeated labeling in surveys, population censuses, and police-led investigations, people have learned how to identify themselves and how to identify others. With my presentation, I wish to illustrate what the science and technology studies scholars have named the double social life of method, meaning that social sciences research methodologies, census included, are not simply tools for learning about social world, but also mean to constitute it. My presentation follows a performative approach by focusing on census practices and highlights that the rehearsal of a certain ethnic self-identification is a matter of learning. People learn through repetition to self-define themselves. In this perspective, the repeated ethnic inquiries on Roma after the 90s should be seen in a larger context of a 2 centuries-old history of surveillance that included a series of police-led censuses in many countries of Europe, some with deadly consequences. I wrote extensively about counting Roma by experts and censuses. For reasons of time, I cannot enter into more details here. For showing the performative powers of the census, I turn now to the example of the last 2011 Romanian census. First, I will look at the educational and the informational campaigns of the census, next to the coding of data, and finally to the resistance of people to ethnic categorization and its interpretation by experts. Let's look now to the education and information campaigns targeted on Roma. In 2011, the Romanian National News Agency released the following declaration of the chief of the National Institute of Statistics, and you could read it on the slide. For the population and household census from 20 to 31st October, Roma should assume their ethnic affiliation. The amount of European funds that can be allocated for their social integrations depends directly on, as much as possible, a correct estimate. This appeal for correct self-identification was widely disseminated by all media channels. Mass media insisted that the Roma should not hide their real identity and register in the census accordingly. In some cases, this appeal came together with the reminder that false reporting of personal data could be punished by fines. The declaration of the chief of the National Institute of Statistics was just one element of a vast educational campaign targeted on Roma and supported by United Nations Population Fund. Beyond the mass media contribution and door-to-door visits, the campaign included partnership with some Roma NGOs for, I quote, refining the census instrument, end of the quote, and, I quote again, a Roma-sensitive training component, end of the quote. The training for the enumerators was delivered through a training of trainers method and aimed to teach them on, I quote, ethnic identity and Roma issues, end of the quote. Furthermore, recruiting and training Roma enumerators was a priority of the 2011 census. The grant document of the campaign states its main aim, I quote, attention should be paid to Roma minority in order to overcome the reasons for not declaring freely their ethnicity. In the spirit of the campaign, even the main poster of the census that you can see now on the slide has as the main message, answer honestly. In addition to the state-led campaign, a vast education campaign for raising self-reporting as Roma in censuses was launched by the Roma NGOs and supported by the Open Society Foundation in more countries in Europe, including Romania. The campaign consisted of hundreds of thousands of door-to-door visits to convince people to self-declare Roma. It was considered a success by the organizers. Indeed, it was. There was a considerable increase in the number of self-declared Roma compared to previous censuses in more European countries, including Romania. The request to the Roma to self-declare in census for improving their lives has, however, not covered the promise. Most of the Roma continue to live in poverty, and most policy analysts consider that Roma-targeted policies have largely failed. Besides, encouraging self-declaration as Roma seems as a less enlightening activist when contrasted to the constant opposition to ethnic data collection of the Central Council of German Cynthia and Roma, given the tragic past of the use of ethnic statistics. I will move now to discuss how the numbers of Roma were made by census and how self-ascription was in fact cancelled by the statistical procedure of postcoding data. The work of postcoding data and its role on the increase of self-declared Roma was less visible for the public. Though in the census more than 600,000 people were recorded as being Roma based on self-ascription, not all of these people declared themselves Roma. For the pilot census, 32 subcategories were merged under the category Roma, and in the end, for the final census, 19 subcategories were retained under the umbrella term Roma. These subcategories, which some of which you could see translated on the slide, came out in consultations between National Statistical Institute and the Roma NGOs. Most of them refer to occupations historically considered by ethnographers and anthropologists to be specific to gypsies. Having 19 subcategories, the label Roma was the most heterogeneous ethnic minority category created by the census. However, since disaggregated data were not provided, it is not even known how many people choose, in fact, the label Roma. The principle of self-ascription was practically cancelled by postcoding procedures applied to ethnic categories. The fact is nevertheless clear. If people would have liked to have reported themselves as Roma, they would have done so and not given other answers to the open question related to ethnicity, as they did. I will turn to the interpretation of census data more precisely on how people resisted to ethnic categorization and how the experts explain this. In the Romanian 2011 census, ethnicity was an open and optional question. 1.23 million, or more than 6% of the total population, preferred not to assign themselves to any particular ethnicity. The number of people not answering ethnicity questions surpasses the number of each of the two biggest ethnic minorities in Romania, respectively the Hungarians and the Roma. Most of the Romanian social scientists and experts interpreted this resistance to ethnic categorization as the greatest anomaly in the history of modern census in Romania since 1930, when the self-reported ethnicity was for the first time introduced. The number of non-answers, which reflected the refusal to identify with a specific ethnic category, was so big that defied all expectations. The interpretation of the high number of non-answers was that the non-respondents to the ethnicity question were in fact Roma, unwilling to disclose their real ethnicity. There is a large consensus on the undercount of Roma in censuses, not only in Romania, but elsewhere, and this undercount of Roma is supported by many scholars, Roma and non-Roma NGOs, policymakers, international organizations, and representatives from across the political spectrum. I consider the consensus on Roma undercount by census is problematic. Neither the expert opinion that Roma are undercounted by census nor the resistance to ethnic categorization in censuses are new. The modern roots of Roma undercount opinion by censuses draws on publication of eugenicist scholars who contested the Roma statistics produced in the 1930 census of Romania and accused Roma of camouflaging and diminishing the purity of the Romanian nation by trying to pass as Romanians. The resistance to ethnic categorization in population censuses is illustrated also by the long history of police-led censuses, sometimes conducted with the collaboration of social scientists. To give two historical but more recent examples, the Bulgarian Communist Party ordered police censuses of gypsies in 1975 and in 1989 to revise the official census statistics considered an undercount of Roma. The same in Romania, you can see a copy of the document on the slide. The Communist Party ordered in 1977 a special police-led census of gypsies to rectify population census data. And yet, organizations such as World Bank and UNDP use the numbers collected by these police censuses even today in their estimates of the real numbers of Roma, even the data were collected unethical and based on undisclosed methodologies. I would like now to conclude by saying that censuses are acting as technologies of population through a continuous process of learning. Networks of national and international institutions are exchanging knowledge for defining and constructing ethnicity. Field operators are trained and train themselves further on ethnic identification. Manuals, instructions, and guidelines are educational tools par excellence and incorporate anthropological knowledge. Last but not least, mass media campaigns and door-to-door visits are among the tools and methods through which the census apparatus teaches ethnic self-identification. After all, what we are measuring through ethnic statistics is knowledge sedimented through repetition in previous social encounters, including censuses. I believe that how ethnic self-identification is taught by census and how it is resisted should be part and parcel of analytical work when working with census data. Thank you very much, and I give the floor to the moderator.
Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. Our third and final panelist is Professor Samantha Borthams of the University of California at Irvine. Samantha's research focuses on comparative political economy, development, and how individuals interact and engage with the state. Her current book project, Manipulating Citizenship in China, informs her presentation, which focuses on the Chinese census. Samantha?
Thank you very much for that great introduction, and I'm so happy to be joining the panel after our last two presentations, because I think my presentation interacts well with a lot of the themes that we were talking about. So I want to talk about both a specific and a general question for motivating this talk. And the very basic applied question is, how many domestic migrants are there in China's cities? So migration is a very common topic to use census data to illuminate. But in trying to answer this question, we're going to get to two larger questions, including how are the same concepts, in this case, migration, measured over time? And also, how does what we ask and what we don't ask affect our understanding of specific concepts? The alternative subheadline of this talk is how asking a simple question gets really complicated really quickly. So I'm going to start complicating it right now. So the very first question that we have to ask is, who counts as a migrant in the Chinese context. And so here's where I have to give you a little bit of Chinese background on institutions, and specifically on the household registration system, also known as the hukou. So the hukou is an identity document that gives a person a location or an address and a type, either agricultural or non-agricultural. There are other types that have developed in the last 10 years or so, and if people have questions about that, I can answer them in Q&A, but the dominant two types still to this day are agricultural and non-agricultural. For those of you who have experience with former Soviet states, it's very similar to the Propiska system, where during the command economy, you were not allowed to physically move outside of your area of location, and all government entitlements were provided by that location that you were registered in, with non-agricultural populations getting a lot and agricultural populations not getting as much. One really important element to the hukou is that it's inherited. So when you move, it doesn't necessarily change. It's more like a birth certificate than a driver's license. So when you move around China, your identity through the hukou system stays the same, even though your location changes. And what's crucially important about this document is that citizenship rights and entitlements depend on your hukou. So full access and permanent access to things like education, pension systems have traditionally depended on your hukou. You could only get them where you were registered. And so migration in China, the reason I bring up the hukou is because migration is determined both by physical location and by your hukou registration. So a migrant may have physically moved, or they could just have been kind of consumed by an urban area and really still been registered as rural. So just to give you a very specific example, here is a zoomed in picture of Hubei province, the capital of which is Wuhan. Now that you all know that Wuhan is a city in China, I can use it as a nice example here. So when we think about migrants, we often think about this migrant here who lives in Jingzhou, a smaller city in the same province, moves to Wuhan for a job. So this is an urban to urban migrant. Then we also have migrants who say, move from rural areas into more urban areas. So from the rural countryside of Jingzhou up into Wuhan. Then we also have what are considered local rural migrants who move from the countryside of their own municipality into the city center. We also have rural to rural migrants who move from the countryside within one municipality to another location within the countryside by this gray icon here. But we also have this new blue migrant that showed up here, which is considered a rural migrant who's never actually moved. Maybe they lived in a suburban village that was right on the edge of the city, but as the city grew, they got moved into a high rise, their village doesn't exist anymore, and this is an urbanized rural population, but their hukou still says rural, it still says agricultural. And so according to some government programs, they're still considered migrants, even though they never physically changed addresses. And of course, we also have the cross-provincial migrants, those who move from outside into a city. So a very long story short, based on the hukou system, we have all sorts of different types of migrants. They can be local, they can be non-local, they can be moving from the countryside to the countryside or countryside to the city. It gets really complicated when we look at the different categories of migrants. So if we're trying to identify migrants as a whole or even break down some of these groups, we have to ask ourselves we have to find some information. So the information that we're looking for when we turn to census data is, okay, well, first of all, where are you registered? Where is your hukou? Second, we have to define the borders of crossing what borders constitutes migration. At one point in time, do you become a migrant? And we also need to know this agricultural, non-agricultural distinction, because if you live in downtown Beijing, but you have a Beijing agricultural hukou, you're still considered a migrant, even though you're local. And then with all migration studies, a key element is the time limit. Are you a migrant if you left home 2 months ago? Are you a migrant? Should that be the same or different from a migrant who has been around for 10 years or more? Okay, so let's dive into the actual census data. So I have 4 micro census questionnaires for you. So yes, some Chinese on the screen. I kept that in just for you, David. So in 1982, this was our first modern census post-economic reform. And this question here, question number 6, is our migration question. And it really defines migration as the relationship between registration and physical location. And it defines location with the phrase 本地, which is translated as local. And it defines our time limit by 1 year. But the problem is, like, what is local? What does local mean? Colloquially in Chinese, local can mean provincial, it can mean municipal, it can mean county, it can mean township, and it can mean the specific address that you are living in. So this is a very, very vague census data, census question to try to identify exactly who you are. And in trying to understand urban and rural, this agricultural versus non-agricultural registration, we don't have a specific question on it in this, this forum exactly. And so what a lot of people used was the administrative level. Were you living under a county government, which is inherently rural, or are you living under a city, which is much more urban? And so these lines up here, this county versus city here, and the couple after it were used to identify urban versus rural. So much more based on location rather than registration. Jump forward to our next census, 1990, the 4th census of modern China. And our migration question changes just a little bit. One, we have a refinement of local means county or city. So now we actually know what local means. And our time limit is still at 1 year. And then we have an added question here, the second question that comes in and asks, is your hukou agricultural or non-agricultural? Jump forward 10 years and things start to get really complicated. So the hukou question is actually broken into 2, this R6 and this R7 here. Our local now shifts from county to village or the street level. So like really, really focused level of locality. And then anybody who is registered outside of this street, outside of this very specific neighborhood or village, now has to answer a follow-up question that has a lot of distinctions, especially for parsing out that local, of moving from within one city to another part of that same city. Jump forward to 2010, and everybody is this also has the agricultural versus non-agricultural question here. Jump forward 10 years, and everybody sighs a little bit of relief here because our hukou question gets much simpler. And so instead of asking physical location related to your hukou, the physical location is gauged based on earlier questions, and the hukou question just asks, where are you registered? And so the 2010 census gives us much more specific answers in a clear way. Anybody who is identified as being outside of this county identifies exactly where they're registered. Okay, so why does this matter? Going to research, so who counts as a migrant? Well, if you move from Beijing to Shanghai, all of our censuses would pick you up. If you moved across the street, it's possible that 1982 would catch it. In 2000, you might get caught up there as well from moving from one neighborhood. Just depends on what across the street means if you cross a specific line. If you change neighborhoods within the same city, you'd get picked up in 82 and 2000, but not 1999. 1990 and 2010. If you move from the countryside to a regional town, it's unclear if you'd be picked up in the 82 census, but you would be in future censuses. And then the all-important distinguishing between short round trippers, say a couple of months, and regular round trippers, those who say work from March until January every year, you're only able to do that in later years. So if you're studying something like welfare, then you really care about these highlighted definitions of migrants, right? We have to think about how our research questions relate to our specific definitions of how our concepts are being measured. But if you're interested in, say, housing mobility and regional clumping of ethnic minority groups, then you would actually be interested in all of these. And you might not be able to capture that over time because our definitions change. Okay, so why do definitions change? First, just to give you a picture and some basic Chinese context changes over time. In 1982, there weren't that many migrants. There were very few migrants out there to be captured because the hukou system really locked people in place and limited migration before 1979. By 2000, there were about 100 million, and the top line estimates from the 2020 census suggest that there's 360 million cross-municipality migrants. So that's larger than the population of the United States, being defined as outsiders in the Chinese context. The last little bit here is on political changes. So there's national level reform. National level reform was meant to kind of to dissolve this population or dissolve this floating population, but they've had limited impact. So changing the definitions are actually a strategic use of data. So just on broader implications, it's important to remember that measurements change over time. Using the same data, even from the same country, does not guarantee capturing the same phenomenon. This applies broadly, right? So this is just migration in China, but it also applies to questions of race in the United States. Some very quick best practices: clearly identify the actual questions that sources use, critically evaluate research that uses data, and how they operationalize different concepts. And then what the censuses do ask and what they don't ask are equally important. So there, I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Samantha. I'd like to encourage all of our attendees to go ahead and send questions for our esteemed panelists into the chat. I will go ahead and read out the first group of questions, and we'll look forward to more on these very evocative and thought-provoking presentations. The first question is from Lawrence Cooley. He asks, I asked Kyle what sort of possibilities there are, if any, for citizens to influence the design of census language questions in the cases he is looking at. Are these questions decided in a purely top-down manner, or is there activism that seeks to influence the design of the question? Why don't you go ahead and take that, Kyle, and then I'll go through the rest of the list, if that's okay.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And I should also be very clear that we have at least two people in the audience and on the panel who were involved in developing the Russian censuses. And so they should definitely feel very welcome to chime in and correct me if I say something wrong or if they have additional information that they want to add. So the short answer is that there are definitely opportunities to influence design of questions, perhaps not directly. So I'm not aware of any sort of system by which you can appeal directly. However, in a lot of cases, especially, again, going back to the native language question, which serves a lot of purposes for especially ethnic activists in different regions, as well as local governments in different regions, the native language serves a really valuable purpose of sort of increasing the proportion of people who actually appear, at least based on the native language question, to speak the language. So if you're interested in showing that your group is big and active in maintaining its language status, then protecting this question is really, really important. And there was definitely a lot of activism on the part of both, activists as well as regional governments to first, the native language question was taken out in the first post-Soviet census and then brought back in. I guess also so it was taken out of the first one. There was a huge uproar against it, and it was brought back in 2010. Again, for I think a lot of these reasons that I was discussing here, it was taken out. I think also because it was not necessarily the best question for measuring what the Russian government was interested in measuring, which is again more along the lines of proficiency, which they did continue asking a question about. The other thing that is probably very worth mentioning here is that it's not just top down in terms of like the government deciding what other questions are going to be, but it's also top down. So in the sense that international organizations and social scientists are also involved in helping design some of these questions. So for example, a lot of the questions that you now see in newer censuses about say the language that you use at home, the language you use most frequently. So better questions about measuring actual linguistic proficiency. Those are the result of international actors and social scientists, both domestic and international, trying to influence the census to gather data that are more in line with what they're actually trying to gather. So there's definitely opportunities for activism and definitely opportunities for citizens, as well as different actors within a country, so regional politicians, to actually influence the census questions, at least in that regard. So thank you for the question.
Hey, thank you, Kyle. Our next question is from Svetlana Hrustova. She begins with an apology. She might have missed the explanation, but she would like to ask Dr. Surdu why particularly the Roma were not differentiated in the 2011 census in terms of the answers with various Roma subgroups. Sir?
Thank you very much for the question. It is very interesting, and I will use the concept of incentives that Professor Marquardt proposed in his presentation. I think there were various incentives by different stakeholders. First, as I put on my slide, it was the declaration of the chief of the National Institute of Statistics in Romania, who said that the bigger the number of Roma in Romania, the bigger the funds that will come for the social integration of the Roma. So it was a financial incentive to count as many Roma as possible. So in this case, so the anthropological knowledge on Roma subgroups were used in order to cancel the granular identities that people choose for themselves in the census. So Roma was just one category from the 19 used by the census, but under this umbrella category, all other 90 categories were brought together, because Roma, it is also a political statement in a way, and it is also let's say a financial incentive for the policymaker and for the government. So the second stakeholder involved in this undifferentiated count of the Roma in the 2011 census was given by activists. There were the Romani NGOs in Romania who were motivated to show bigger numbers of Roma because they could have a better representation by bigger numbers of Roma. They could attract more attention, they could raise more funds, they could raise better the concern. So again, an interest in cancelling the granular identities for a political identity, so to say.
Thank you very much. Rounding out, we now have a question for our third panelist from Josef Karapek. Thank you for all the wonderful presentations, and he has a specific question for Dr. Borthems. China has been pursuing a city-driven approach to economic development. It seems systematic inequalities between rural and urban residents remain. What kind of reforms does the Chinese government do to gradually seek reform of the current hukou system to provide better access to social benefits?
Great, thank you for that question. So since about 2011, the central government has really been pushing to try to alleviate this urban-rural and the hukou-based distinctions. And the policies are really kind of three-pronged. And one is encouraging people to actually transfer their hukou and making it a little bit easier for them to do so. So that would essentially, when you move, you might be able to change it more like a registration status in or a residency permit in like Germany, where it's an application process rather than this jumping through 80 different hoops as it is now. The second is giving migrant populations a residency card, which is like a half version of hukou that would give you some benefits, but not all. So for example, the plan is to do elementary education through residency permits. So you can put your kids in elementary school, but not college.
Nice.
So it's a step forward, but there are some limitations. And then the third is to expand social welfare programs to kind of integrate, especially that urban and rural, that agricultural and non-agricultural distinction, because education, health insurance, pension systems, when they were initially designed in the 1990s and 2000s, the modern systems at least, they were all divided on hukou lines. So you had urban resident health insurance and rural resident health insurance. So these have been going on for a while, and there's a lot of research now saying that they're not working particularly well. So I would say hold your question and look for my book in a couple of years when I actually get it out on the first one, which is about this transfer system because local governments control it. On the second question of residency permits, there are a lot of scholars in China who are studying the difference, like does the residency permit actually compensate? And the answer is sort of, but not really. And then on the final question of the expansion of welfare programs, I can recommend Xian Wang's book on health insurance in China, and when local governments decide to expand to include those non-hukou people, or to just pour more money into the privileged pot, essentially. And so this is an ongoing question that a lot of research is dealing with right now, that says some improvements, but highly varied below the national level.
Thank you so much for that. We now have a question for both Kyle and Mihai from Yon Marandici. He has this question. He's wondering whether the Romanian and Soviet censuses allowed individuals for mixed marriages to pick multiple ethnic self-identifications, or did they constrain respondents to just pick one ethnic category or language? For example, could individuals with Roma and Romanian, or Roma and Hungarian, or Romanian and Hungarian, or Russian and Kalmyk parents choose two ethnic groups on the census questionnaire? Gentlemen?
I can go. So in the Soviet census, there was no opportunity for multiple identification. So it was, you are either Kalmyk or you're Russian or you're whatever, well, not whatever you want to choose. But yeah, so basically, yeah, it was dichotomous of a specific ethnic identity. With language, there was, again, like the opportunity in many of the censuses to provide both your native language, as well as if you spoke a second Soviet language fluently, you could report that as well. Though one sort of fun fact about the second Soviet language point is that, like, both the fluency thing is interesting. The second thing is important because, again, you can't declare your native language as a second language. Also, they took the Soviet language very, very seriously. So for example, if you were Romanian, you could not declare Romanian as your second language, or if you spoke language as Romanian as a second language, if you spoke Kurdish, if you spoke German, those were not Soviet languages, and so they were excluded. But in general, and obviously English, if you spoke English fluently, you could not declare that. So it was only, you could only declare a second language that was within the Soviet system. So you could declare two languages, but they had to be either your native language or a second Soviet language.
Thank you. I looked into detail to the first Romanian census in the 1930 and to the last one in 2011. And I analyzed also a little bit the census from 1977. And the nature of the censuses was a possibility to choose two ethnicities, so to choose two ethnic groups. So what I want to say is that the last one in 2011 was an open question. So in theory, people could have been creative and, let's say, put or mix together two ethnic identities in a single category. But however, I think the census would not register that, because as you've seen, it was a process of post-coding data, not only for the category Roma, but also for other minorities. For example, the Germans, the category German in Romania as a minority accumulated 7 different other categories. And I wanted to do another short observation, which in a way is related to the question. So even the ethnicity of the children was, let's say, decided by their parents. So it was a question to which the parents could answer and state which is the ethnicity of their children. So the subjectivities of the children were excluded in this case, and this is also in the case of mixed families.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a follow-up question which raises many interesting points from Veronica Byte. This is to all the panelists. She would be very interested to hear your positions on states not having census data. For example, Slovenia stopped gathering census data in 2000. The argument being state institutions gather census relevant information from various statistics. However, these very nuanced questions of self-identity are entirely omitted. Thank you for very inspiring presentations. This is an excellent question because it's not just when we count and who we count, it's when we don't. Panelists, would anyone like to take a first crack at this?
Maybe I could start by saying that a well-known example is that of Germany. So Germany is conducting the census by means of a sample, a representative sample at the level of population. And this fact has to do with a big scandal that was in the middle of 70s, if I'm right, that the census is infringing privacy data. So all this was going into the justice, and the justice was taking the decision that not to do any more censuses at the level of the full population, but to work with samples. And I think this is a good idea for the same reason that justice found it a good idea. So yeah, privacy of people should be respected.
Okay, thank you. Kyle, Samantha?
Yeah, no, so this is a really, really interesting question, and I don't have a definitive answer. I mean, I can say from sort of a social scientific perspective, I find the census data really, really valuable, not just because of the data that it provides, but also the insight into what the government is interested in. And again, like the scale of the government, of the census itself means that this gives you really, really good insight into like what the government considers to be important, what their sort of policies for these type of identity issues are. So with the Russian census is always very interesting to see what sort of new groups emerge, how different groups are being counted, what groups are being divided, because that gives you really important insight into what sort of policies are being pursued or being thought about. And so like the fact that the census is so big makes that a really, really important thing to actually look at, or a very, very valuable source of information that I'm not sure if we had a more sort of like, well, if we started doing something like the Community Value Survey in the United States, well, the Russia actually does that also. They have a more detailed microcensus every couple of years also that provides additional information about populations in a more detailed way using a sampling methodology. But if we started just doing samples, like again, I think it might be more easy to ignore and might not have the same sort of like bearing of like the large census that I think gives us a lot of important insight. So I'm not answering the question, but I'm telling you from my own personal research interest, it's very good to have census data.
Yeah, so from the Chinese perspective, so I'll just say from my own personal bias as a survey researcher, right, well trained in sampling statistics and whatnot, I do have a partiality to samples and sample surveys and the value that they add. But there's a big caveat, which is that a lot of the surveys done in China outside of the Census Bureau use a sampling method dependent on household registration. So they go to the local police station and they get the list of everybody who's registered, because anytime you move, you're required to register with the local public security office. But people don't, right? So a study in 2005 used a spatial sampling method and compared it to a register sampling method in Beijing specifically, where it's you would think that the security bureau is the most on it. And the sample based on the register missed 85% of migrants. So a lot of sample surveys are really not at it. Like the mentality and the goal of the surveys are not very helpful for those, especially for those of us who study migrant populations or more mobile populations, because they're the ones that get missed out. There are a couple surveys in China that focus specifically on migrants that improve upon this standard. But right now the standard is still to use registration records. And to deviate from that would be to admit that registration records aren't good, which is not something that most, especially local governments, are going to be supportive of. So I still see quite a bit of value to the census.
I'll only toss in the fact that the US Census debated with scholars and census officials trying to encourage the use of sampling instead of going through the expense and difficulties with complete enumeration. And it was roundly ridiculed and thrown out by Congress. So this is a debate that touches on many, many countries. So thank you for that wonderful question, Veronica. Our final question, I think, we have a couple more. We have a question from Gerard. I am going to make a mistake here. Marushiak, I hope I've got that at least close, who writes, I would like to deliver only a short comment to Samantha. The system of hukou, propiska, is very similar to the system of Heimrecht, home right in Austria-Hungary. It was elaborated after the introduction of local self-administration in 1849 in the Austrian part. It provided the right to live in the municipality of one's birth, as well as an access to social welfare systems provided by the municipality. The system of Heimrecht survived till the end of the Habsburg monarchy, and at least in Czechoslovakia, it worked until 1949. Probably this Chinese model is a result of Europeanization processes in this country in the 20th century. I'm interested, what do you think, Samantha? I think it's more of a propiska linked policy, but I'll leave it to your expertise.
So actually, the hukou system, especially if you talk to a lot of institutionalists in China, really started in about 600 BCE. So the process of registering households and defining, especially citizenship duties, is imperial, and it's thousands and thousands of years in history. And so if I'm not a scholar on the propiska, but the use of the hukou in the command economy had been part of the Chinese policy conversation for a long time. So these two institutions developed around the same time. The Chinese system is quite a bit more pervasive, especially in the early years of implementation, but it's definitely built on imperial legacies, and the what really changed to the modern hukou system was in the 1950s, when the government actually started providing more citizenship rights rather than duties, and then specifically controlling who was allowed to exit and who was allowed to enter. But the right to reside in a place, that goes back to the imperial era in China, well before the modern era. And there are many examples of this throughout Europe, and especially in Switzerland also has an example of this. So a lot of these kind of developed at the same time, but at different stages in development. But the Chinese one is quite old in its institutional roots.
Okay, thank you so much. I have a very, very broad question, so I'm going to ask Kyle to be quick on this, if I might. I'm sorry, I'm watching the clock. Lada Kolomiets writes, I have a question to Kyle about the all-Russian population censuses that just began. Are there any peculiarities about it? Maybe your top 10 peculiarities, I'm not sure.
No, actually, so I'm really interested in seeing how this all turns out. So, I mean, I'm still not entirely clear about how it's all going to work out. So I'm really not going to be able to give a very definitive answer to this. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that are going to be very interesting to see what's going to happen, especially, well, not just in Russia, but around the world with the entire COVID situation and how that's going to play out in the methodology and as well as how it goes out. So that's going to be the big thing that I'm going to be focusing on, or I'm interested in.
Okay. Thank you. We also had a wonderful comment from Isabel Cote. Thanks to the speakers for 3 great presentations. With all these variations in census categories over time, and just for my own work, I would throw in simple definitions, not just of ethnicity or language, but even how you measure what a household is or what a family is has changed over time in the Russian to Soviet censuses. Since all of that change is taken within the same country, cross-country comparisons based on census data must be very challenging. And I would certainly reinforce that wise comment. It can be extraordinarily challenging to do this sort of work across censuses, emphasizing the caveats about preparing for your research that Samantha so wisely listed at the end of her presentation. I also want to encourage people, we have some resources available as well about census access, and facilities like the Minnesota Data Archive that has the international IPUMS holdings, where they will draw random samples of censuses in certain waves across a number of countries for researchers. And so you've got those materials available to you through ASN as well. I also would like to point out that Eastview has a new census service. It is not covering all of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union yet, but they certainly have very reasonably priced access to primary census records for a number of countries in the region. And it might be something some entrepreneurial census or center director might want to put into their Title VI budget as they prepare for those grants this spring. So I think that that sort of comparative focus is something that really makes a great deal of sense. So Isabel, thank you so much for that wise comment. But also, as Kyle well knows, going from the Soviet censuses to 15 individual countries pursuing different censuses, different modalities, different reliance on face-to-face versus mail-out census forms, that the comparisons are thorny. They're extraordinarily fruitful, but they are also extraordinarily challenging. So thank you for that wonderful question. Panelists, did anybody else want to chime in on that?
No, I mean, I think the one thing I would maybe mention is that I think one really interesting development, especially in the United States, is the opportunity to choose potentially multiple categories, which is
Right.
actually what Eon asked about, which I think is like much more in line with how most of us conceive of ethnic identity, languages, and other things. And I think that's a super positive development, though it's obviously a nightmare for people like us who are trying to do a time series.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that allowing people to have multiple identities and allowing people that to be reflected, I think is becoming more widespread, and I think that's normatively a very good development, though. Bad for the
And
time
so,
series.
right. And so the US Census is using this for the second census in a row. I will argue that with increasing uptake of multiple identities, we have a perfect example of the populist takeover of some and misrepresentation of census data, because far right outlets bemoaning the decline of the white population aren't bemoaning the decline of the white population, they're bemoaning the decline of the white only population. And so as we get more people using multiple ethnic and racial identities, and indeed those are our fastest growing categories on the American census, it does unfortunately lend itself to some strategic misinterpretations of some of the trends and results. So that's something to keep in mind as well. At this point, I believe we've covered the fabulous questions from our terrific audience. I want to thank you all for attending and also thank our panelists. At this point, I will hand the microphone back over to Zsuzsa as our Director of Virtual ASN and thank her and the organizers for this opportunity.
Thank you, Cynthia, and everyone on the panel and all participants for being here for this really inspiring conversation about something as important as the census, which might seem to many of us as something technical, but at the same time, we know that everyone encounters it. And regardless of what aspect of society you're studying, you are going to rely on census data in some form. And we are going to have another panel about how it relates to identity, census and identity, which will be less about the problems of categorization and taxonomy that you have discussed today. So that will be in the second part of this season, probably in January, February. Stay tuned for that. But I'd like to just say to everyone that this is what is, I think, remarkable and valuable about Virtual ASN, that we can bring this kind of high quality conversation to you. And you know that ASN is associated with a particular region or sub-regions of the world, but Virtual ASN reaches beyond that, so we can discuss big questions comparatively, globally, and in ways that are not usually done in a more confined spaces. So there is something to this hybrid and virtual environment that can add and complement what we are doing in person, and hopefully we can go back to doing in person. So I'd like to say also that we are going to have another discussion about a big question next week on November 4th about nationalism and religion. I hope you will come back to that. If you just Google Virtual ASN, you will find all the information about it, and consider becoming a member. And I hope that you will continue watching us and downloading recorded conversations, using them for teaching, for reminding yourselves of the thoughts that these conversations have been provoking. So with that, I'd like to close it and thank you everyone for being here, and please come back.